Thank you, Mark. Dear host, Madam Minister of Defense, Excellencies, former presidents, prime ministers, ministers, ambassadors, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, salam alaikum. Let me first take this opportunity to thank ICD and Skopje Cultural Diplomacy Forum for organizing this excellent conference. My heartfelt thanks go to the people and government of North Macedonia for their hospitality. Let me also take this opportunity to thank the people and government of North Macedonia and all of you representing your great nations here for your continued solidarity with Afghanistan, Afghan people, and your at least 2 decades of investment and dedication to the Afghan people's cause. This morning, my dear friend Mark asked an important question. How relevant is cultural diplomacy to today's world and especially to conflict zones? It's an important question which is in fact the foundation of a new policy proposal that the National Movement of Peace and Justice for Afghanistan, to which I belong, is going to present soon to national and international actors to garner their support for a safe and acceptable future for Afghan people. This morning we listened to Excellencies, and I'm grateful that they shared their wisdom so willingly with us and defined cultural diplomacy in an important way. We take it that the purpose and function of cultural diplomacy is to promote understanding, tolerance, hence cooperation among people and nation states, to coexist peacefully and to resolve their disputes peacefully. If that is how we define cultural diplomacy, then it is absolutely relevant to Afghanistan and to the region in which we have to get to grips with these challenges, some of which I must admit is our work, but some others are the work of other nations. So therefore, the international community has a responsibility to support diplomatic initiatives to address the problems that some of which they created. Specifically, in our region, which is one of the hot spots in today's world, in addition to climate change, the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the unprecedented level of tensions in the Pacific region, you name it, in the Middle East, our region is also a hot spot that is not adequately addressed as yet. There are geopolitical, geostrategic rivalries. There are unresolved conflicts. There's use of terrorism as an instrument of policy. Some nations use it, let me correct myself, some governments use it as their national security instrument. Now, this is partly driven by conflicting interests, but also by fear and misunderstanding. Diplomacy might be an instrument not only to help them resolve these conflicting interests and coexist, but also eliminate the fear which is driving them to use means of violence against each other. We were hoping that Afghanistan was a case that represented such a wisdom and common understanding on the part of the region and the international community. But unfortunately, because of the disastrous failure of the Afghan leaders and some of our international partners, what we built together for at least 2 decades with blood and treasure, that we lost because of somebody's failure and somebody's poor judgment. Hence, it's now a responsibility. It's a shared problem and a shared responsibility that we have to get to grips with. With this, let me make, dear colleagues, I know this is a heavy afternoon and there has been an excellent offer of further generosity. My 4 quick points: how diplomacy can help us address the future of Afghanistan. My first point, that the current situation in the country is deteriorating, whether from a human rights, women's rights, humanitarian perspective, or economic, security, and political perspective. On this, there is consensus, both among Afghans and the international community, and in the region. But where we are sad that we do not have consensus is that something that deteriorating situation is going to affect only the Afghans, and its spillover effects will not be a threat to the region or beyond the region. That is a sad part, because we are just repeating the mistakes that were made before, and it needs to be corrected. Second point, is the international community's response, or that of the Afghan political leaders, adequate, effective to the current situation? The answer is unfortunately no. They don't understand, and they don't make a clear-eyed assessment of what is going on there, and therefore they're unable to have an effective and adequate response to it. The Afghan politicians run the risk of credibility. They're disunited, and there's no unity of purpose and effort among them. Again, much to the disappointment of the Afghan people. But on the international community side, what we see, by international community I also refer to the region in which we live. What we see is a great deal of unhelpful reductionism in foreign policy. So therefore you hear voices. Maybe it's time to normalize with the Taliban the relations that we have. Maybe it's time that if the Taliban can move a little bit on the issue of counterterrorism or women's rights, that we treat them as a normal state. This is such a poor understanding of what is going on, and it's not going to produce a sound policy. What needs to be looked at is not these small changes to certain policies. It is a new future, an acceptable end state for Afghanistan that will have to be at the heart of the international community's response to achieve. So they should aim correctly that changing one policy on one thing is not necessarily producing the result that we are collectively hoping to achieve. So it needs to be an end state, an acceptable end state to the Afghan people, which would also be helpful to the region and the international community, i.e. remove the threats that the region and the international community are facing because of the spillover effects from Afghanistan. But what would be at the heart of that end state, at that acceptable end state? Can the Taliban actually live together with the rest of the Afghans who are dedicated to human rights, democracy, and fundamental rights and freedoms of all Afghan people, women and men alike? The answer is yes. If the Afghans and the international community come together to exercise their leverage together with the Taliban. The alternative is going to be disastrous anyway. If there's one way that we can succeed, that is through negotiation and through peaceful settlement. But for that settlement, there needs to be a principle on the basis of which the Taliban must agree. That principle is nothing but the basic right of any nation, which is the free will of its people, its citizens, men and women, will have to determine the future of their country, the laws of their country, and the governments of their country. If the Taliban agree to respect that basic principle, the free will of the Afghan people, the rest of the Afghans will be ready to coexist with them in one country, in one political system, and maybe even in one government. Rather than going into details of that end state, I just highlighted the overarching principle for the Afghans. And that principle also gives us the assurance that the Afghan people will never allow their land to be used by terrorists, domestic or foreign, against them or anybody else. They would never want their land to be a producer of refugees or drugs. So the free will of the Afghan people is our insurance policy. If the region and the world community and the Afghan leaders are to have one insurance in place, that is the will of the Afghan people against all of the menaces that over 40 decades of conflict have actually produced in the country. But how can we get that political settlement? Only through negotiations, not between the international community and the Taliban, but between the Afghans. It will have to be intra-Afghan negotiation, peace negotiation between the Taliban and all the non-Taliban Afghans. The role of the international community is to facilitate, to support it, and to help them implement the outcome of such a negotiation. That brings me to my last point. Is this really possible? Would the Taliban accept negotiation now that they are in power? Again, those who bring up this argument for not trying intra-Afghan negotiation must know that their current approach has not produced any result, any positive result anyway. But there are ways that we believe that the Taliban would consider such negotiations important for their own interests. There's something called the Doha Peace Agreement, signed between the United States and the Taliban. As much as that agreement is dreaded by people, it has certain obligations, at least 4 obligations: counterterrorism, withdrawal of foreign troops, intra-Afghan negotiations, and a new political settlement. Unfortunately, the parties of the agreement are so selective in terms of the obligations of that agreement. They've chosen the counterterrorism obligation, but not the intra-Afghan negotiation and a new settlement. What we are saying to them, that if you are to have any credibility in the eyes of the Afghan people or the world community, honor your obligations, both of you, the parties to that agreement. Now, why would the Taliban honor it? Because the agreement is linked by the Taliban to their personal and regime security. The stakes cannot be higher than that. If the US was to withdraw from that agreement, the Taliban would never have any peace of mind for their own security or that of their regime. So the power of that agreement, that legal obligation, that political obligation, will have to be harnessed in support of intra-Afghan peace negotiation. So the agreement needs to be reviewed, its implementation needs to be reviewed by the United States and the UN Security Council, which endorsed it. I know this is a bilateral agreement, but the UN Security Council endorsed it. So it's important, an important piece of international accord that needs to be fully honored by both sides. Second measure that they will have to take in this regard is to maintain the consensus in the region and the international community about the future of Afghanistan. Counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, Afghanistan not to produce refugees are at least the 3 critical interests, not only in the region, but also beyond the region. And despite what is happening in Ukraine or elsewhere, these 3 still remain some basis for cooperation in the region and within the international community. So that cooperation will have to happen through a UN-led process. I am glad that the UN Secretary General has initiated that process, but it will be important that these influential nations support it. We turn to our Muslim country partners and say to them that you also have a role to play here. What Taliban represents in the name of Islam does not represent the true tenets and values of Islam. this was clearly demonstrated by a harsh criticism of President Erdogan of Turkey when he said that the Taliban policies on women's rights to education and work are non-Islamic, are not consistent with principles of Islam. We need more of those voices from Muslim countries, from their statesmen and women, from their religious institutions. Again, a critical part of cultural diplomacy. So that the soldiers of Taliban, or those who believe that what they are doing is Islamic, can fully understand that this is not the view shared by the rest of the Muslim world. That will be an important basis for legitimacy of new policies and a new settlement. With this, ladies and gentlemen, I come to my final point, and that is that while we are working on a political settlement using the opportunities that a diplomatic approach might offer, we have to continue with our human rights work and humanitarian assistance. On human rights, we have to look at seriously on effective deployment of international justice architecture, including the ICC. If there is a message to be sent to the perpetrators and to violators, not only of the past, but also of those who may continue to do that with impunity, then an ICC engagement would certainly help. But then that requires, again, a strong resolve on the part of our international partners. I strongly believe that the cause of the Afghan people has support and sympathy across the world. I hope that that is also shown by the states of influential countries who may be able to do something. Thank you.